So I'm Chris Lilley. That's already been mentioned, and kind of that and that as well. That wasn't mentioned. I was one of the authors of PNG. Oh, and I was the first working group chair for CSS until they kicked me out. But more relevantly, I'm one of the editors of CSS Fonts 3 and Fonts 4. And today I'm mostly going to be talking about the Fonts 4 spec. I was also involved in the first fonts working group, the one that came up with that font face, and WAF 1 and WAF 2 and stuff. Yeah, anyway. Today, first of all, I'm going to do some basics to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of terminology and stuff. Then I'm going to talk about variable fonts. How many people here have heard of variable fonts? Yeah, okay, great. And then color fonts. How many have heard of color fonts or used them even? Less. Yes, I thought so. And lastly, a bit of recap. This is more from CSS Fonts 3. It's the open type features. So that's the program for today. Okay, so does anyone know what this is, by the way, this picture here? Shout out if you know. Yes, it's movable metal type, and it's backwards because when you put the ink on it and press into the paper, it comes out the right way around. So, a little bit of terminology. First of all, what is a character? A character is a number. It's a code point. It's a place in Unicode. So, for example, the letter capital A is 65. But it's more than that. It also has some properties. So capital A is a capital letter. It is not a lowercase letter. It's not a space. It's not punctuation. It's not a number. So this set of properties is associated with a character. A glyph, on the other hand, is what you actually see on screen or in print. A glyph is the visual representation of the character. Now, you can have one without the other. For example, if you happen to be blind and you're using a text-to-speech converter to read web pages, then you have characters, but the characters, instead of being converted to glyphs, they're being converted to sound waves. And similarly, if you see something and it has all these, what are they called, tofu, the things of missing glyphs, then you might think you haven't got it, but you have. The characters have come down all right. If you copy and paste them somewhere else, the characters are still there. It's just the glyphs that are missing. Okay, enough boring basics. Let's do the testing part. So this is how many characters. How many characters have we got here? 1, 2, 3, how many? 1. Someone said 2? Yes, good. 2. Hopefully it's 2. 2 characters. If you type that as 1 character, which you can do, you've just lost your search engine because it won't actually, people are never going to type in an FI ligature. So this is 2 characters, ideally, and 1 glyph. Similarly for here, we have either 1 or 2 characters. It could be a precomposed E acute, or it could be an E with an acute accent separately. But it should still be 1 glyph, and hopefully only coming from 1 font. If it comes from 2 fonts, it will look terrible. Bit more terminology. So, font family. So Myriad Pro is an example of a font family. And here we have 6 or so different faces inside that family, light, Roman, bold, etc. The naming for these is completely non-standard, by the way. Every single font family comes with its own names, sometimes quite creative, but you can't assume that light in one is the same as light in another, or that they look similar or anything. Now, I guess everyone knows what a CSS property is, but you might have heard of descriptors, or you might have thought they're kind of the same. You'd be a bit confused, so let me explain the difference. So here's an example. We have a rule for an H1. It uses the font family property to say it wants Arvo, and it has the font weight to say it wants bold. And we also have an at font face. So the H1 styling rule is telling you what you want to see. The at font face is telling you what a particular font has. If you download that font, it will be called Arvo, and it will include the bold weight. So therefore, these two match up. So the top ones are descriptors, and the bottom ones are properties. Now, typically, we don't just use a single font family. Normally, we use a set of them for more reliability or for whatever. And the first font in that list that A actually exists and B has the glyphs that you want is the one that's used. So you've probably seen, if you've ever had an email in English, say, but from someone who's Japanese, and you'll notice that it looks really weird, it's really horrible glyphs. And that's because your email client has decided, okay, this is using a Japanese encoding, so it's found a font that does Japanese, and the Latin glyphs in that are pretty terrible. And the standard way to avoid that is you put the Latin font first, and then the Japanese one second, and so you get nice Latin glyphs. And that works up to a point, until someone says, I'm going to extend this, I'm going to cover Greek and Cyrillic as well, and maybe a bit of Japanese, let's put in some hiragana in here. And then suddenly you get some badly designed Japanese glyphs, because the European designer doesn't know what they're doing there. You can't put them both first, so you have to do something else to solve that problem. Does anyone know how you would solve that problem? Okay. Has anyone heard of Unicode-range? Good, quite a few people. I find that more people have heard of it than know exactly what it does. So let me explain. It's a descriptor, so it's describing a font, and it tells you which range of glyphs in the font you're allowed to use. It makes no promises about what's in the font. It doesn't say you cover everything. It basically, think of it as the opposite. It's telling you which bits you can't use, you're not allowed to use. So here's an example. We have a font here which is for Japanese, and we have a Unicode range, U plus A5, U plus 4E00 to 9FFF, and so on. And just looking at those numbers, you can immediately see that this is the yen, the kanji, the hiragana, and the katakana, right? Just yeah, nobody can. So I have an apology to make at this point. I came up with this syntax. Unicode was brand new. We weren't sure if it would take off. Everyone wrote it with U plus because it was this weird Unicode encoding and not the encodings that people actually used. And this sort of thing with question marks and stuff looked like a reasonable syntax to me. So I posted it to a mailing list and said, how about this? And a week later I said, how about this? Any comments? And then I said, okay, fine, I'm going to put it in the spec for now, just as a temporary measure until we come up with something better. And that was 22 years ago. One proposal actually is to add names of scripts, so you could actually say things like Japanese, Korean, instead of having to have this list of numbers. That would also be more robust, because the range increases all the time. Like, for example, Japanese just added a new character just this year because there's a new king, new emperor rather, and so he has a new name and it has to be added and so on. So rather than maintaining these fragile lists, it's better if it was just a keyword. So I'm going to give an example of this. What I want to do is have a nice swirly ampersand. I'm saying this and that, and I want the and to be an ampersand. And I don't want to have to put a span around it or anything horrible like that. So we can use Unicode range. So there's my markup. It's just an H1. And I've got a font face there, so I'm going to add ding, and there it is. And it's only applied to the ampersand, because what we said with the Unicode range is only use this character, don't use any others. I mentioned that sometimes people get confused by Unicode range. They think it's somehow talking to the server and saying subset a font for me. It really isn't doing that. Even in this case, if I was downloading this font and it was some huge font, I'm downloading it and using only one glyph from it. There are solutions in terms of subsetting fonts, but I won't cover those in this talk. We're still designing some of those. Okay, so on to variable fonts. So if you're used to designing in print, you don't care about download size. You just care about the final result. So here's a typical print-oriented font family. It has, as you can see, a lot of different weights. It has thin to ultra bold, and it has condensed and narrow and regular and wide, which is great, but it's also 37 downloads. You really don't want that. So the idea with a variable font is, and this is new in Fonts 4, you download one font which contains the instructions to interpolate between an ultra thin and an ultra bold. And then you can ask for anywhere in between, and it'll give it you. So it's not that you get 37 variations, you get thousands of variations. And you interpolate along what's called design axes, and I'll explain what these are. So here, for example, is to do the weight axis. Here's a letter Q. And here is another letter Q, which is thinner. And you notice that the points all match up one-to-one. That's important. They have to be designed like that. And then basically the font contains the middle weight Q points. And then for the others, it has a diff. It's like, move this one a little bit over here, move that one a little bit over there. That's how you make the light. And move these ones the other way, this much, and that's how you make the bold. And at that point, you can interpolate, or the operating system can interpolate between them to get any weight in between. This is new in OpenType 1.8, so it's about 2 years old now. Now, if you look in the font spec, there are these what's called registered variation axes, which have cryptic 4-letter codes. One of them is italic, which is pretty much on or off, right? The slant, how much it tilts over for an oblique font, the width, the weight, as we saw, and optical size. One of the things with metal type is that you would actually have a somewhat different design for the big ones and for the medium ones and the small ones. The small ones would be somewhat simplified, so they would hold up better. They would have less variation between the thick and thin strokes to aid legibility at small sizes. So OpenType variable fonts also allow you to have optical sizing. And here's how you use these, using a new property called font variation settings. First of all, you look in the font to see what numbers it supports, and then you pick a number on that range. That's kind of horrible, right? You don't want to do that, really. But before we get on to what's the better option, let me give you a quick question. So I've set font weight to 400, and then I've set font weight to calc 9 times 100. So what do I get? Hands up for 400. Hands up for 900. Hands down again. Hands up for I wasn't paying attention. And hands up for we don't trust you, Chris. This is a trick question. You know me well. The answer is, in fonts 3, it was 100, 200, etc. These were not numbers. They were strings that looked like numbers. You couldn't have anything in between. It was just 100 or 200, etc. In font 4, we changed that, obviously. It's now actually a number between 1 and 999, which is exactly what the OpenType spec says, which then allows us to have, as we said, any intermediate weight. You're not restricted to multiples of 100 anymore. So here's an example. So now font weight, 362. Why not? Whatever you want. And font stretch, 70, where 100 is normal, 70 is narrower than normal, 125 is wider than normal. Font optical sizing, auto. Right, if you're setting it in 32-point type, you don't want to also say font optical sizing 32. You're just repeating yourself. So we basically have an on-off switch there, auto or none. And this is much more convenient than the raw OpenType things, because you don't have to look in a particular font. You just use numbers that are the same for all fonts. So there we are. That's the same table you saw before, but now with the properties and also the descriptors that correspond to them, font stretch, font weight, etc., the stuff you already know. So let me give you an example here. This is a font called Kairos Sans. Sorry. Okay. This is a font called Kairos Sans, and it's at weight 300, which is fairly thin. And there it is at weight 800, much bolder and blacker. And then we can ask for any value in between. Yeah, you can animate them as well. It's fine. You can animate it if you want. Here's another animation. What's happening here? The font weight is being animated, the X height is being animated, and a new custom variable, the roundness of the glyphs, the extent to which each one looks like a circle, is being animated. And here's how we would declare that. So we have this font family, Dunbar, and we've said, now notice here that the descriptors have two numbers. Font weight 100 to 900, that means that's the range that it covers. Not all fonts cover the whole range, but you can also, of course, since it's a descriptor, you can say how much of the range that it supports you actually want to use. Maybe you only like the darker weights anyway. Or font stretch 50% to 200%, that's quite a wide range there. And font style, it goes from minus 10 degrees, that's 10 degrees leaning backwards, to 40 degrees forwards. And then in the actual rule, we've said where we want to be in that design space. The font weight, 234, the stretch, 80%, a little bit condensed. Oblique, 24 degrees, and no optical sizing. Actually, you wouldn't normally do that. I just put that in for example. You would normally leave optical sizing on. And then going back to the low-level stuff, the font variation settings, we have an axis called radius, which is or radi, which is this roundness thing that I mentioned. That's specific to that one font, and therefore you have to use the low-level feature to get at it. And of course, you can animate it, as I showed. So I talked about these standard axes, but also fonts can have any number of unique design axes. So here's an example. This is a font by David Burlow called Decovar, and it has variations for rounded slabs. What's a rounded slab, you ask? Well, it's like this, coming out at the end there, like that. And then those slabs can also be flared, like this, pointy slabs. And then the internal of the font itself, it can be made into a skeleton, like that. And also in the terminals, we can hollow those out as well, possibly a different amount to make something like this. So now we have a completely different font. So this font is actually letting you kind of redesign it along certain axes. Right, so this example, this font, I mean, this is a really nice code bend by Mandy Mitchell. This font has an axis called leaf and an axis called stem, and it makes little growy things on the edge, which is being animated. Plus there's some, SVG filters and stuff going on here. It's a nice demo. And you can do all sorts of weird shit like this. This font basically is made up of a single interpolating square, and all the other glyphs are made up of combinations of those squares. Cool. But this is a more realistic example. So here we have a $sign, and as it gets bolder, you notice the middle line is interfering with the swoop of the S shape. So beyond a certain point, the designer chose to cut that off and just have it at top and bottom. So they're actually switching between one glyph shape and another partway through the interpolation. Now, I've been talking about these axes as if they are entirely separate, and they are, but it's good to use them together. So let me give you an example. As you can see, as the weight goes up, the length of the line gets up because the glyphs get bigger. And we can also have a condensed thing which starts off smaller, but again, as the weight goes up, it gets bigger. But if we combine those, as the weight goes up, if I go to a slightly more condensed thing, I can actually keep the fonts the same width. And what would I use this for? Suppose I have a sort of a newspaper site and I've got the heading, and the heading has a certain amount of space. I don't know how much that is going to be. And it'll have a certain amount of text for the heading, and I don't know what that is. But I want it to be as big and bold as possible and take the exact width. You could do it like this. So this is what you call copy fitting in print. So here's another example. This is great. It's animating the font weight. It's animating the X height. It's animating the space between the glyphs, the kerning, so that it always occupies the same space regardless of where it is in that design space. That's quite nice. Because of this, Jason Parmental, who writes quite a bit about fonts and design, said that he thought that variable fonts are the most significant development for design on the web since responsive design itself. It's like responsive design 2.0. Okay, that's us done on variable fonts. Now we'll go on to the next topic, which is color fonts. I'm sure you will remember the illuminated manuscripts that, there's a big push whenever you're doing work for a client. They say, the one thing we really want is to have nice illuminated capitals. Okay, they don't actually, but the real reason that we have colored fonts is because of these things. There is an urgent need to have multicolored stuff. And of course, the early versions of this were kind of crappy. They were just bitmaps, maybe bitmaps at different sizes. Doesn't work very well, doesn't look good. So this example, which I used as the header for this section, quick little story about this. I was at a font conference about 9 or 10 years ago, and there was a chap who'd gone around India looking at all these sign painters. People hand paint signs. They're going out of business now because it's been replaced by cheap mass production. But he wanted to capture this skill while it was still alive. And so he got these people to design fonts for him, and they're like, well, we don't have computers. How are we going to do this? Draw them out. Just draw out the shapes, and I'll make them into fonts. So they gave him huge, like as long as from here to the end of the room, bales of cloth, lovingly painted in all these colors. And they're like, here's some letters for you. I thought, well, you can't make fonts out of them that are black and white. Why? Okay, well, now we can actually make fonts like that. So here's an example using the fonts that were designed there in India, delivered as hand-painted images. This is an example. Does it look good? Does it look nice? Can we use this? It doesn't look that good, especially when you see that that's how it's done. This is the same text done multiple times, the different font on each time and in color. In print, no problem. This will work perfectly fine. On the web, 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 saying the same thing 8 times is a really bad idea. Let's not do that. But now, so I actually took these fonts, brought them into an editor, colorized each one, saved them out as one of the new color fonts. There are 2 ways to do this that use vector fonts. One of them is called color and CPAL. COLR holds the actual true type glyphs, but instead of just a single outline, it has multiple ones, and each one can have a color. And the colors are stored in a color palette. So there's an example. Okay, is this better? This is a real font. Is that cool? Is it cool? No, it's not. This is awful. This is terrible. What did I say I did? I brought the fonts into an editor, I changed the color of all the layers, I saved out my fonts, and I used it on a web page. This isn't how we do things. Where did the styling go? If I want to have different colors, what happens? No, this is terrible. So in CSS4, we have some new properties. One of them is called font palette. So fonts can have multiple palettes. For example, you might have some colors for dark background, some colors for light background. Okay, so you can select between them. Much more interesting. A new @rule, @font palette values, lets you, oh God, come on. You can override the, can you still hear me all right? You'll adjust it, okay. It lets you override some or all of the palette values. So let me show you what I mean. This one is the other way of doing colored fonts, by the way. You're using SVG graphics inside the OpenType to hold the graphics, and then you're using palettes again. But now you're using CSS @rules to override the palette values. So there we go. This is actually live using the SVG in OpenType. Again, it's live editable text. And here's an example, and I pick one of the colors and I change it, and there it is changing. Okay, that's fine. Now we've got the control back in our style sheet where it belongs, so that's good. Oh, and here's an example combining both color fonts and variable fonts and a little bit of a typographic joke. You know about the cap height, right? Cap height, the height of the caps. Well, this has a cap height axis and it lets you adjust the height of the cap. Okay. And lastly, I wanted to mention quickly, so there's all these options now with fonts, and you need to do some sort of @supports rule. So we've added a support onto the font technology thing as well. So you can have your source with a URL, and you could always say what format it was, OpenType, TrueType, etc. But now you can say things like, oh, OpenType, which supports color brackets COLR. So you'll only download that font if you actually support that type of font format. And these are the options. You can actually say whether you support features, whether you support variations, whether you support color in color or SVG, or SBIGs, which is Apple's own weird one, which uses raster, so don't use that. OpenType features. This is the old stuff, but until now it's mostly been used in print, and it is actually usable in style sheets now. Until we had downloadable fonts, you couldn't rely on this, right? Because you didn't know what features were in a particular font, but now you provide the font so you can depend on the features in it. And there are two syntaxes for this: font variant, which you should use, and font feature settings, which is low level, horrible, and I don't recommend you use, but until recently it was more widely supported. So I'm going to show you the font variant because the support is really improving now. So here's an example. If you look at these numbers, they look fine with the uppercase letters, but they don't look so good with lowercase letters. They're in typography, they're called lining numbers, but the other alternative is old style numbers, and then they line up nicely with the lowercase letters. They have ascenders and descenders. So these are all great little one-line additions to your style. They have fantastic fallback, because if the browser doesn't support it, you just get what I showed you the first time. It's still perfectly legible. It's just not quite as nice typographically. Fractions. There are code points for half and 3/4 and things like that, but you don't want to use them. Firstly, for searchability, you want to have 1/2, like that. And if you want some weird fraction like 13/27, you're going to have to make it yourself anyway. So what you do is you set it like this, and then you put font variant numeric to diagonal fractions, and they'll turn into fractions for you. Similarly, proportional numbers. If you've got numbers in a table and you want to quickly see where they are, you want them to line up in columns, and you don't want to have to use a fixed width font because that looks ugly. So instead you say just the numbers. You want them, instead of being proportional, you want them to be tabular, like that. And then the numbers all line up. First, second, third, etc., the ordinals, there's a way to make those look better. Like that. And just in case you think I'm cheating because I'm doing it in English, let's do it again in French. Yay, hooray. And the ligatures, I started off with this example with this interesting font. This is it with its normal set of ligatures, but if I sit on the fancy ligatures, we have to have an LE and RO, things like that. It looks very nice. And the third value is none, which you'd never really use, but here it is. Switches off all the ligatures, including that FL, so the F is now actually colliding with the L, kind of. It doesn't look very good. So you shouldn't do that. You may have noticed if you download a font, you download just one font, and then you merrily use bold and italic and whatever, and it works, right? You've got bold and italic, and you might not think about that too much, but where did they come from? The browser fakes it on the fly. Okay, it slants things over to make not an italic but an oblique, and it draws a little thin line around each glyph to make it bolder, which is kind of disgusting. Let me give you an example here. I'm going to switch the font. Look at this. Look at this. This is already an italic font called Rochester, and it's made a fake slanted italic version of it and a fake bold. That is really hideous. So this new property lets you switch that off. Say, I don't want the browser to synthesize fonts for me. This is kerning. I guess you know what kerning is. It's pairwise connections between characters that would otherwise bump into each other or be too wide apart. And if I switch that off, it looks more ugly. And that's distinct from letter spacing, which is a constant amount of spacing between each glyph. And also that can be negative, and you shouldn't ever do that. So I mentioned that I'm using font variant all the time. And I said that there's this font feature settings which you shouldn't normally use. Here's a case where you would use it. Here's a chemical formula, and this font has support for chemical formulae, but I'm going to have to use the low-level font feature settings to scientific formula. And there we are now. This chemical formula is easy to read. I I haven't got much time now left, but want to tell you about this website called What Can My Font Do? It's called Whack-A-My Fondue. It's a kind of a pun. It's very nice. You drop a font on it and it tells you. So it's not actually uploading the font anywhere. It's doing all the work on the client side, but it analyzes the font, tells you what open type features it has, which layout features it has, and even gives you examples of it and bits of CSS that you can copy in. So this is a great, if you don't have the tools or the technique to open a font yourself and modify it or see what it can do, this is great. It examines the font, tells you what you can do, and you can see what it does. It makes best use of the fonts that you have. So I'm going to end up on that note because I think I'm running out of time. Hopefully that was useful and instructive.
Amazing. Wasn't this amazing? We're going to do a little... It was. Chris is a bloody professional there and prevailed through those technical issues. This is why he goes around the world doing this stuff. We've got a few questions from the interwebs, from around the world. Sorry, I'm standing over here. Sorry. I just realised I'll stand over here. So, we've got a few interesting ones. Is there any advice you can give for people who want to make their own fonts in this way? Maybe even converting them to like a regular font to a variable font? Is there anything like that? Oh, hang on. You might have to use this.
Converting a regular font to a variable font is actually tricky. It really has to be designed that way because all of the points have to line up between the different weights or the different styles. In practice, though, that's often how designers design fonts. They interpolate them like that. They don't draw all the different weights themselves. It's just that previously what they then had to do was make all the individual instances and spit them out as individual fonts. But there are tools which are available to make fonts, and you should have a look at that. I mean, a common thing to do is that you want just 1 or 2 extra letters. You want, you know, an E with an acute and a diaeresis or some weird thing for some other language that's not well supported. And that's fairly easy to do. You can put that together quite quickly. And so you should also look out for fonts that use what's called the open font license, which allows modification. These are free fonts, but not only are they free to use, but they're free to modify and edit and make derivative works from. So they're open source fonts, effectively.
Amazing. Open source, even in the font world. Do any of these font animations affect performance in any way?
Yeah, like animating anything, the more you do, the more work you do, the more it affects it. But it's really no different to animating the width of a div or something. I mean, yeah, you're having a redraw on and possibly a reflow on each animation frame, but it's no worse than any other animation.
Okay, cool. I think we've got time for a couple more. We're a little early on things. So we've got some amazing stuff we can talk about. There's a very specific one here that lots of people seem interested in. I'm going to read it out in full. Do variable fonts allow for entirely different italics? For example, a single story A character, while the regular A of that font is a 2-story glyph. I don't completely understand this. Maybe Chris does.
Yeah, so for people who don't understand it, a 1-story A is like that, like a circle with a line on it. And a 2-story... I'm going to stand at the front here so the lady who's signing can see what I'm doing. Okay, good. And a 2-story is the one that starts at the top here, comes down and has a loop and a tail. It looks like a G upside down. It's that sort of thing. That's what they mean. So there are certain specific glyphs that are associated with italic. Italic is not obliqued. Italic is a completely different set of designs. And normally what we do is we switch between them. Something is either normal or it's oblique. I have seen precisely one font that does that incrementally. It has 4 intermediate steps and it switches on the 2-story A partway through and it switches on the swishy G 3/4 of the way through and so on. So you can have a degree of italicness. That's a fairly unusual requirement, and you would normally actually do that using what's called glyph variations or stylistic sets. I didn't have an example of stylistic sets here, but this is another thing you can get at in your style sheet.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I've got an emergency backup mic here. We're back to the old school days with wires. There was actually a couple of questions, weirdly, from people I feel are in the scientific community, maybe. And those are questions about, can we replace libraries like MathJax, which is a way to show scientific and mathematical equations on a page using JavaScript? Can we do anything like that with these fonts?
Not to the extent that MathJax does. So, I mean, I showed a thing where I can make a fraction, but what I can't make is a fraction where the numerator is actually also a fraction, which includes an integral, which also includes a fraction, etc. I mean, mathematics has that all the way down. It's fractions all the way down. And you can't do that yet. The OpenType fonts don't have that capability. There is another table in OpenType 1.8, which is called the math table, which is specifically designed to help mathematical software access these other features. So you can do, for example, integrals that cover 5 lines, that sort of thing. But really, that still needs to be done. There is no substitute yet for MathML or for MathJax, which can take either MathML or LaTeX. You still really need to use that for anything other than the most simple equation.
Working for a scientific publisher, I was really hoping there was going to be a nice answer there.
Yeah, it would be nice. There is a community group at W3C that's looking about, they've shifted their focus from MathML to math on the web because they're open to other possibilities. Maybe because, Markdown has a nice way of coding stuff, and they're looking at a Markdown-like style for doing equations that's sort of easier to type rather than MathML is very verbose and baroque. But yeah, at the end of the day, you still need a renderer that understands. Mathematics is as complex as all the rest of typography put together. So,
okay, you heard it here first. Avoid mathematics whenever possible. I wish I'd listened to that as a teenager. So I think this is a very pertinent question, this one, and it's one I'd like to know the answer to. What is your favourite font or font family?
I couldn't possibly answer that.
No favourites from Chris there. No favourites. And also, you mentioned variable fonts and such. Are there any resources out there that people can go to find these?
Yes. So there is a site called vfonts.com, v-fonts.com. And that has examples of not just the free fonts, but also the commercial ones. They have an arrangement where they can have rendering samples of that on their server, so you can play with them. And beside each font, it has a sample of it. And it also has sliders for all the different axes, so you can see what they look like, play with them, etc. It's a great resource.
That sounds amazing. I think that's all the questions we have. Chris, thank you so much for bearing with us through all of this. Can we have a huge round of applause for him, please?